Hey everyone, hope maybe you'll wake up a little. And hello to anyone watching as well, to acknowledge you in the room even though you're not here. I wanted to talk about recreating map monsters because I think so many of us are often intrigued and in wonder by these wonderful, weird creatures that many people thought existed in the depths of the ocean. They're so cool looking, and I obviously have a special fondness for old maps if anyone has seen some of my previous talks or read my thesis. And there's also beautiful painted huge map monsters, as it turns out, in the Vatican and probably other very wealthy old buildings. My friend recently visited the Vatican and sent me photos of these, so I just wanted to share. So if you want to recreate map monsters yourself after this talk, I just wanted to let you know that a quick Google search will give you a plethora of options, and there's many high-resolution scans of these because there's so many amazing libraries that have done the work and helped get them online for you. One of these options is Library of Congress, but there's just so many, just for your awareness in case you've never Googled map monsters before. And why did I want to do this, besides the fact that map monsters are obviously awesome, and besides the fact that this is a fun project? I think that map monsters are a great way to showcase and learn the usefulness of adding graphics to maps if you've never done it before. And they're also a fun way of learning how to recreate aesthetic elements in a style that you want to recreate yourself, and viewing those elements that seem complicated as building blocks. Because sometimes when you just look at something that looks really beautiful, like a piece of art or an old map or a map monster, it just seems really overwhelming. First, I'll just kind of talk about the usefulness of understanding how to break things down for graphics. I'm sure all of us know how great graphics go with maps. This is a beautiful National Geographic map, and these are some great illustrations to go along with it. Obviously, these are highly detailed illustrations and maybe not stuff that we want to recreate. And if that's the case, I think it's still great to think about how graphics are broken down and understanding the stylistic elements behind it, because you get to work, if you're working with graphic designers and illustrators, it's a good way to be able to more quickly communicate with them and also pull in elements to your design. The maps in this were made by Claire Trainer, by the way, National Geographic as well. And if you really get into it, you can recreate old maps like this 1800s map of the UW-Madison campus. Dylan Moriarty, who you saw talk earlier today, took on that colossal project of recreating this entire map and drew out the graphics in addition to drawing out the maps, and also embedded his own personal style into the graphics and pieces of the map itself. And he actually has a really great write-up on his website. Highly recommend checking it out if you are interested in recreating styles and recreating graphics. And finally, of course, if you're thinking about breaking down styles outside of maps, it's also very useful because sometimes you just have a job that wants you to do extra things like create graphics. And I wanted to showcase this because we're so used to breaking down and generalizing the world as such a complicated space, and graphics are just generalized things. So I just generalized a sea turtle and made this graphic in the same way that I can generalize the globe and turn it into a map. So we're all very capable of doing this. We all can do it if we want to. You don't have to. It's cool if you don't want to. So this wonderful map monster is going to be the map monster I use as an example moving forward. All right, so first I'm going to talk about how to use Adobe Illustrator image trace, and I'm actually starting out with it in Photoshop just to remove some of the background because that just makes the image trace a little faster once you get into Illustrator itself. You don't have to do this, but if you do, it's a little faster. And then you want to direct select the image. An image trace is located over there, but in some cases it will have some elements missing. But what is great is there's actually an image trace menu that you can use that will give you much more customizable options. And this is a high fidelity option, and as you can see, it is fairly close to the color use, and it also gives it a sort of painted feel. However, I wanted to still kind of keep it two-toned so I could customize it if I wanted to. So I chose the 3-color option, and the third color was white, so it's still kind of two-toned. You have to select it, and then select the expand option to make sure that it actually becomes separate vectors, and then if you want to go in and ungroup everything so that you can go ahead and delete anything or move things around as you want. I'm gonna use the direct select tool, the white arrow, to delete everything that's not the darker lines. So deleting the brown, and I also make sure to delete the white if you don't want it, just because it makes it a little easier to select things. And then once that's deleted, you'll start obviously deleting extraneous stuff if that's your thing. You also can keep all the other stuff if you want. And when you're working in the map monster, you might notice after an image trace that there might be some nodes that you want to move around, and you can use the white direct select tool to select it. And I noticed that one was super pointy, so I used that up there. It doesn't have a name, it's a curvy thing to make it more curved. And you also can make them pointy in the other option that was next to it. And if there's something the image trace did that obviously was a mistake, you can go ahead and use the scissors tool to snip 2 nodes, like cutting across paper, and then remove that bit. Just make sure you use the white direct select tool arrow to select it, because if you select the color itself, if it's a compound polygon, it actually deletes everything. But luckily we have Control-Z, so I Control-Z'd and made sure to select it. And if you use the scissor tool, make sure to right-click and join the path so that it's still a whole polygon. And I'm just using that curve tool again because I didn't want that selection pointy. And actually, after those few tips, you actually can go in to your heart's content and keep editing the monster, and you could finish that way. But there's still another tool that you can use to mass erase a polygon, and that is the eraser tool. And it also simplifies the paths, as you can see, and it just does it a lot faster than using the separate scissor snips and such. And if you don't like some of the pointiness and the curves, you can go in and edit it. You can make things pointy. And this took me probably about 10 minutes. So this is a very fast way of recreating a map monster. And if that's all you really want to do, then you have made yourself a map monster. However, I think if you want to make things a little more customized and stylized and really want to follow the exact aesthetic elements, then you might want to consider the building blocks that are going into that particular aesthetic. And I just wanted to show you what you already know for your daily tasks if you're making maps every day. We already use building blocks when we make maps in the underlying data, the fact that there's points, lines, and polygons, all the colors are a building block, as well as the texture, physical if you're doing things by hand, and the visual texture as well. And the technologies in which maps are created are very important in the building blocks, because what technology you use will dictate how fast or slow something will take, in addition to how smooth or textured some visuals may be, because different options provide different tool sets for getting the visual that you want. So you want to make sure you're picking the stuff that you want to do it in. And verbally, maybe that doesn't make as much sense, but Molly O'Halloran's website is a beautiful example that shows the variety that can happen when you make things by hand, like this wonderful watercolor. And she also wonderfully did me a service by happened to show how she makes things on the side. So here it says watercolor and illustrated. And then the next map is an illustrated map that also has vectors on top, which that vector data makes it look very different. And then the next map is a map that many of us are very used to making, which is vector maps. And these all just look very different initially, and that's simply because of a lot of the technologies that went into making those. So you want to be thinking about the aesthetic building blocks when you're making your map monsters or whatever you may be making. And luckily, it actually is exactly the same as what you think about when you make maps. Points, line, polygons, colors, texture, and technologies. So if you're very lazy and don't want to think about breaking it down, for map monsters at least, you can check out my thesis, and you don't have to read it if you don't want to. You can just scroll to the bottom to the results. And I have these very wonderfully set out spaces that visually give you a means of, hey, I want to make something with this very specific font that looks like this map monster from like the 1400s, or I want the color to look as saturated or as textured as old maps. So you can go ahead and look there if you don't want to think about it. I have you covered for your laziness. Don't worry, laziness is part of design too, finding the fastest path. So for this particular map monster, the aesthetic elements mainly are the line work. It's very detailed. It's a lot of thick and thin lines, but they're tapering, they're inconsistent, and a lot of cross-hatching. So building blocks, line work tips. So in Illustrator, I just wanted to show you what I think is the best way to start actually customizing your own map monster, and that's just using the arc tool to initially outline the map monster and then start like creating that outline. And this takes a little bit of time, but I think it's better because then you know where each node is and how to get there instead of kind of going backwards after the image trace. And then I just made a bunch of lines there just to show you the capacity that Illustrator already has in it for creating lines. This is the brush tool, and this is the artistic calligraphic palette. And it immediately shows options for changing the tapering of lines and the width, which is exactly what we want to emulate for the aesthetic elements in this particular map monster and many other map monsters. And then what's great is there is a variable width profile, which is exactly what you want to be doing. And you can use that as well to customize the lines. And what's not mentioned in this talk, but what's also really useful, but a little more complicated, and you don't have to go there, it's not that complicated, but like you can make patterns in Illustrator as well, and I just didn't get to it because there's just a lot to cover. But just to show you all the different tools that you can use. And I did not trace the entire map monster because I felt like that would not be a great use of time to show you guys that. So I just wanted to show you another lazy way of getting the trace of the map monster, where it's mostly approximate and a little better than the image trace, and you just make polygons using whatever shapes and pencil tool polygons as well. And then you can merge this using the Pathfinder tool and the merge tool. And then I also recommend, because this is grouped now as a grouped object, I recommend making it into a compound path. So it's actually one polygon, and then you can make it into a line for reference. And now begins the work in copying those line elements. So this is just a simple line, and I quickly changed the tapered ends, so now it looks a little cooler. I changed the thickness just because that's what I felt like, and then I started copying and pasting it because that's what vector programs are great for. You can quickly replicate stuff. And I changed the angles a little bit, and here I started changing the thickness of the lines to align with the fact that there was inconsistent line widths in this visual. And I'm also expanding this so that I can clip it to the outline that I created. And so then I made the outline into a polygon again. You select both at the same time, and then use the Pathfinder tool again, but this time use intersect. And I used the wrong one first, because sometimes you get confused, but you can just Control-C and click back. And now it intersected to that clipped path. So here I am again, just tracing as you do. And this time I'm just showing that you can use the pencil tool as well to trace. And if you want to go in and quickly change some of the nodes, you can use Simplify Path, and that'll quickly simplify some of it, and you can adjust less nodes than if you just directly use the pencil tool. And I realized that I had clipped to the wrong part, so I'm clipping to the arm there using the same workflow that I just talked about, the intersect tool. And I just went a little farther just to show how quickly just some line work can really get you to where you want to go for the visual. So here's a thicker line and a thinner line, still using a lot of copy-paste, honestly, and just rotating some of it. And then I'm just clipping some of them using the scissor tool. And I did that in like 2 minutes. And that was the result. I did not keep tracing because I wanted to keep showing other stuff. So this is another software. It's called Corel Painter. I know many of us probably don't use it, but I wanted to show it to everyone here, because if you ever really want to emulate textures and things that are handmade, but you're not hand making something yourself and you want to use a screen, this software has every possible kind of texture for every possible art space you can think of, including paper textures. And If you have a graphics tablet, it's also really fun and you can quickly make things, but you're not required to have one. I just happen to have one, so I just had fun showing how far you can go with a different texture. This is a marker sort of texture, and the other ones were just showcasing the amount of blending you could do while maintaining the texture of paint. This is my really terrible matte monster that I drew by hand. And maybe many of you are thinking, when will I have time to make matte monsters? Well, I often think about this, and actually maybe some of you know about Creative Carto, but if you make time with your friends to practice stuff, it's great because then you have motivation.